Hi everyone, Rosie here. Welcome or welcome back. I'm going to resist the urge to go, how is September over already? How is it already October? Because, I do that mentally every day and I don't need to do it on camera every month too. But it is that time. It's time for the September wrap-up. The first book I read in September was Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which is, honestly, I have no idea how to summarize this novel. It was really good, but I don't know how to describe it. It's essentially a biography of Orlando, who starts the book as a boy in Elizabethan England and ends the book as a woman in 1928. There's, as you can guess, some pretty strong magical realism elements. I'd actually read a fairly detailed summary of this before I even started reading it, and honestly I'm really glad that I did, because one, it made me way more excited about the plot, and two, knowing what was going on a bit made me sort of, I don't know if follow along is the right word, because honestly I don't think I got this book. It was enjoyable, I liked reading it, but it wasn't one that I was really interested in sitting down and like highlighting and note-taking and like really thinking about as an, student of literature way. I just wanted to read it. So it was good, but it wasn't great, and honestly I think that's on me. I don't think that's a criticism of the book. I think it's just what I was looking to get out of the book was not exactly what the book was. I will say, however, that I did love the writing, so even if I feel like I didn't fully appreciate this novel, it was an enjoyable read. Next up, I read Moccasin Square Gardens by Richard Van Camp, which is a super short but super delightful collection of short stories set in a fictionalized version of Fort Smith, which is a town in the far north of Canada. It's a town with a large Indigenous population, and this was a really candid, in both a positive and negative way, look at that community and what life is like in such a small town, in such a remote place. It was just really lovely. I enjoyed it a lot. The blurb that I had read, however, said that the collection was haunted by a mythical type creature that had been awoken by greed and climate change. So from the description I sort of expected it to sort of pop up here and there throughout the stories, which wasn't the case. There's two stories super focused on this concept, and they were interesting, but they felt sort of out of place in the collection, I'm not gonna lie. The rest of the collection was so grounded in reality, I found, whereas these two were more attached to the mythical. So they were still interesting, but it just felt sort of like they were randomly inserted in. And I wasn't sure about that, but on the whole, I really liked the book. I thought it was really good. They were really great short stories. And I think the author has a bunch of other stuff that's been published. I think he's been writing for a long time, so I'm definitely going to pick up more of his work. Another super short but super delightful book that I read in September was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, which is a sort of window into the life of Kiko, who's 36, and she's been working at the same convenience store since it opened 18 years earlier. And this was such an interesting perspective for me, because Kiko is not someone who finds the anonymity and the formulaicness of convenience store work stifling or frustrating. Instead, she thrives on it. She's like, oh my god, I finally understand how to interact with people. I follow these rules and it's positive. So that was really interesting. And then this book sort of follows as she starts to question that. She starts to question whether she's really happy, whether she really has a role in society, whether she should try and pursue the sort of path in life that her sister and her friends and her family want for her, if she should try and find a partner and get a career job instead of just working at a convenience store, and what the consequences of that are for her. I will say there's a character who, even if the novel doesn't really identify him as such, to me reads as a total incel, and his character and all of his interactions with Kiko are just frankly pretty hard to read. But don't let that put you off. The ending was super satisfying, and I really enjoyed this. This month's Toni Morrison pick, because as you probably know, I've been on a total Toni Morrison binge lately, was The Song of Solomon, which is longer than the other novels I've read by her. And it's the story of Macon Milkman Dead, who is born just after a man jumps off the hospital where he is then born. I think it has elements of magical realism, but it's such like delicately and well worked in magical realism that honestly I'm not sure. There's a lot of points in this book where I'm sort of left questioning of, is this actually magical realism, or is this a character's perceptions and beliefs in literary writing? So I don't know if I'm describing this well, but I thought it was really interesting. I really liked that way of writing. As a lot of Toni Morrison's novels, at least that I've read so far, do, this one focuses on basically a family. We see stuff from Milkman's ancestry, his father, his aunt, his grandfather further back. We don't really see any children past him in this one, but something I found so captivating about this is how she peels back layers and reveals information so carefully and slowly that just when you think you've figured out, okay, oh, this is what's going on with this family, this is like the true story, we get a perspective from someone else and they share their side of the story or their experience, and all of a sudden you're left totally questioning again, like, who's telling the truth here? What's reality? Who knows? Because all of the characters are so convinced that their story is the truth that when they tell their story, for me at least, I was like, I buy that you're telling your truth, but that means which one of these is actually true? I don't know. One element of this novel that was heartbreakingly relevant, given that it was published in 1977 and set before that period, is the discussion of violence against Black people and the response of the police and of institutions of power. So many of the conversations that the characters have about this topic, or the way it's presented, you sort of look at it and go, if you changed out the slang, this is something, a conversation someone could be having right now. And that's kind of heartbreaking. Not news, but really jarring to see it so clearly. Something that was written almost 50 years ago, I guess? What is the passage of time? I don't know. On a final note for this one, it's a lot more plot heavy and sort of things actually happening heavy than a lot of the Toni Morrison novels I've read so far, I think. And maybe that's just a function of it being longer, I'm not sure. But that was interesting. I wasn't expecting it, and I wasn't expecting the places that this plot went, but I definitely enjoyed it. Throughout most of the month of September, I was reading Underland by Robert Macfarlane, which is a non-fiction book about everything that goes on under the surface of the earth. So it's sort of an interesting mix of personal narrative with history, science, mythology, writing. Essentially in every chapter, the author visits a new cave system or man-made sort of underground thing. You know, there's a chapter with the catacombs in Paris, he goes down into salt mines, that sort of thing, just a lot of caving and climbing and that type of stuff. And he uses each visit to a new location to talk about that location, to talk about things under the earth in general. It was all very sort of stream of consciousness, fairly literary writing, and every chapter is augmented by a new and increasingly larger-than-life cast of characters as he meets people in these places that he's visiting, and he goes caving with them and they tell him about the area. So those parts were really interesting. One thing that I'll say, it's not a criticism exactly, it's just something that I didn't enjoy, is that the last couple chapters are really focused on the effects of climate change. And it's not that I'm not interested in reading about that, but this was written very much in a, oh my god, huge impact, like, it very much emphasizes the crisis aspect of it, which is important. But that's not something I need emphasized to myself. I have incredible climate crisis anxiety as is, so emphasizing the crisis without discussion of hope or possible solutions, for me, just isn't something I'm particularly interested in reading. Again, not to say it's bad or that those weren't well written or interesting. It's just, it didn't really vibe with me. And unfortunately, in general, this book was good, but it wasn't great. I wanted to like it a lot more than I actually did. I think personally, I would have preferred some more in-depth and focused writing on some of the topics he covered, because while everything in this book was super interesting and there were so many things, it was like, wow, that sounds amazing and I would love to learn more, but it was very all over the place and not super well connected necessarily. And honestly, just a lot of what he talked about left me going like, you've spent a paragraph on this, but I want a whole chapter. I want to know more about this. Don't just glance over it. So it was good, but not exactly my cup of tea. And word of warning, if you have claustrophobia, this is not for you. I am not a particularly claustrophobic person, and it had me going like, oh my god, I need to stretch out. Oh god, that's so tight. Switching to a much cozier type of hole in the ground, I also read The Hobbit by JRR Tolkien this month as part of the Tolkien Along. In case you're unaware, The Hobbit is the story of Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, and he has his quiet, cozy, comfortable life of basically not much going on, interrupted when he is recruited as a burglar for a dwarfish mission to steal their gold back from the dragon who stole it from them. And of course, this sets off a series of adventures and all sorts of exciting things happen along the way. I did not remember liking The Hobbit as much as I did when I read it this time, so that was lovely. I also did not remember liking Bilbo so much, but he is a mood. Wow. Very relatable protagonist, honestly. All in all, this is a super fun book. The writing is lovely. I found it really pulled me in, and it's so perfect for this time of year because I don't know why, but reading this book makes me, even when I'm just like sitting in my apartment, which definitely does not have a fireplace, feel like I'm curled up by a fire and Bilbo's telling me this story on a winter's night type thing. So this was a delight, and I'm really glad that I've reread it. Next, would it be one of my wrap-ups if I hadn't read a Terry Pratchett book? This month it was Moving Pictures, in which the alchemists have invented moving pictures. They up and move camp from Ankh-Morpork to Holywood, and a whole host of people, humans, trolls, dwarves, otherwise, start finding themselves mysteriously drawn to Holywood with a sudden passion to work in the moving picture industry. But as the cliques become more and more popular, it starts to have an effect on the fabric of reality, with, as you can imagine, consequences ensuing. Not sure how I felt about this one, honestly. The main protagonist, Victor, is frankly just really forgettable. I always forget that he's even a main character in one of these books. We do get guessed about the talking dogs, so that sort of makes up for it. But that lack of like strong interest or connection with the main character I just find lets it down a bit. In general, I honestly find the side characters in this way more interesting, and I feel like I would rather read a book about one of them. But that might just be because we don't spend nearly as much time, so they don't need to be as compelling or as engaging. So maybe it's just that sort of grass is greener effect, I don't know. I also feel like the pacing is kind of odd in this one. I was not at all connected to the characters or invested in the plot and the story until quite close to the end of the book. This all probably sounds very negative. I still enjoyed it. It was a fun read. I would recommend picking it up, but maybe don't start here if you haven't read much Pratchett before. And read it because you like his writing, because his writing is hilarious. It's very funny. Seeing how he works all of the Hollywood history into the Discworld was wonderful. It's just not my favorite. Throughout the month, I also listened to an audiobook, which is something I have not done in years, but I thought I would give it a go. And I listened to All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, which is the story of two children/teens in the lead up to World War II and then throughout the war, culminating with a brief sort of chance encounter where their lives collide for, frankly, just a few hours after the D-Day invasion. And then they go their separate ways again. And the two characters are Marie-Laure, who's a blind French girl who's been raised by her father, and Werner, who is a German orphan who's a prodigy with radios and gets selected to go to an elite Nazi military school and ultimately serve in the Nazi army. I would be really, really interested in hearing from someone who is blind or otherwise visually impaired, but reading the sections about Marie-Laure was fascinating. It made me realize I don't think I've read many books, if any, with a blind protagonist, so that's something I'd be interested in doing more of. But just the way everything was described was so interesting. And another thing I really appreciated about her story is it made me realize that I don't think I've read that many books with such a lovely father-daughter relationship. The part of her story before the war of her childhood with her father was just really magical and lovely to read. On the other hand, Werner's story, seeing the rise of Nazism from the perspective of a child in Germany, was also strange and fascinating. I know a criticism I've seen a few places of this book is that Werner really doesn't take much of a stand either way for or against the Nazi ideology, but that didn't really bother me, and honestly I think it makes sense. We see that he has internal hesitations, and we see that he has moments of going, I'm not comfortable with this, but given his character and given his place in the world, I actually think it makes sense to see him have private hesitations but not outwardly express them and like join a resistance movement. It was sort of a very, very chilling reminder that even people who love their little sisters and aren't really necessarily comfortable with the things they're taking part in can do terrible things. On the whole, this book started off kind of slow and I wasn't super into it in the first couple chapters, but as it kept going, I was more and more hooked and more intrigued and fascinated to know how their stories were going to come together, because the timelines jump back and forth, so you know from early on that their timelines are going to come together, but you don't know how, so that was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I will say it's not super violent, especially given the setting, but like it does not gloss over or shy away from the brutal, horrible, violent things that are done during war, so if that's something that you're not comfortable with, proceed with caution. And the last book that I finished in September was Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Pratchett and Keefe, which is a very zoomed in history of the IRA and the Troubles. Well, not exactly a history, I think it describes itself as a narrative nonfiction. And essentially it uses the abduction and murder of Jean McConville, who is a 38-year-old widow and mother of 10, as sort of a driving theme or a lens to look at the whole situation through. It's very, very focused on individual people, so that was fascinating, but also made the first few chapters a bit confusing to me when I wasn't really sure how all this was going to fit together. But as the story progressed, it was gripping. Reading about the different politics and power plays and maneuvering that everyone was doing within the IRA was fascinating. I feel like that part of the book is what people go to mob movies and like mob stories for, or it was sort of like some of the cartel books that I've read, so that was really interesting. The book is really definitely focused on the IRA side of the conflict, and we get the IRA perspective from what was going on in a lot of places, but it doesn't at all try and minimize or downplay or even excuse a lot of the violence caused by the IRA. On the whole, it really presents the conflict in a way where it does not condone the acts of violence taken by either side of the conflict, but it also presents them, and it presents the situation in a way where you can disagree with the choice that was made, but also understand why that choice was made, so that was really interesting. And I really liked that it followed not just the lead up to the conflict and then the conflict itself, but it also went into what's happened since the Good Friday Agreement, what's happened with these people since then, and the various people who've been tried or not tried for crimes they committed. That part was so interesting to me. On the whole, it felt sort of like In Cold Blood, but by Truman Capote, but like over a 40-year span and with a lot more characters. On the whole, I found it really interesting. I didn't know much about this conflict and this period of history before I read this, but I definitely want to read more now. So those are all the books I read in September. Have you read any of these? Did you like them? Did you not? Let me know down below. Also, what did you read in September that you loved, that you hated? I want to know. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button. If you would like to know more about what I'm reading, please hit subscribe down below. And thank you for watching.